So if all goes well, we should be live on YouTube. Yes, meeting is now streaming live on YouTube. Excellent. Okay, so we just need to wait for people to get here, and then should be good to go. Yeah, Heather and I were just talking about our cats earlier, and it looks like one of them just made a cameo appearance.
Yep. The minute the meeting actually started, he decided to hop up right behind me.
Of course, they have a sixth sense for that. Okay. So hello. So there's Miss Fisher, who's Science League coach from Andover High School. And I recognize at least two of my students here. I don't know if you overlapped with Afifa. You might have. She might have been a freshman your senior year, or maybe not. And there's Miss Fisher, another coach. I forget which school you're at.
Woburn.
Woburn, that's right. Okay. Okay.
Excellent.
There we go. Okay, so I have just after 4. Usually we give it until about 4 or 5 minutes after to catch all the stragglers. Just like being back in college where every class starts 5 minutes after the posted time. Or just like high school on Zoom where every class starts 5 minutes after the posted time.
Very glad I was out of school before the Zoom school started.
Yeah, it's definitely got a lot of frustrations, but you know, it's it's where we are. Okay. So for those of you who are in the league, which is almost all of you, 2 of the 3 events are posted. There is one miscreant who hasn't posted his event yet, and that's me. But the other 2 are on the Moodle site. So while we're waiting for people to arrive, I can show what's there. So sure, let's share that screen. And
actually, Mr. Bigler, I did actually have a question about that.
Sure.
Is tissue toss is it a build event?
Yeah, more or less. I'll talk about it in a sec. So we have we have Quirky Quarks, which is a subatomic particle event by Mr. Vigent from North Andover. We have Human Body Systems by Ms. Crowley from Revere, and Tissue Toss is mine. And basically the idea is to throw a tissue as far as possible. So this is one of those, because all of the memes say ignore air resistance, and so this is one of those times when you can't do that. So I'll have a formal description of it, but the basic idea is that you have to throw a tissue or launch a tissue as far as you can, and only the tissue is allowed to be flying through the air. You can't have it encapsulated inside of something, although you can wad it up as small as you want. and basically each team is actually going to have 2 machines. We'll come back to that in a sec. And you have to launch the tissue and then with video show the tissue flying through the air where it lands, and then show measurement of it with tape measure or string that you then measure the length of, or however you want to do that. And then you have to unfold the tissue and show that it's undamaged. Tier 1 will be tissues that unfold back to the same rectangle, no rips, tears, or anything like that. Tier 2 will be tissue may be ripped, but all the pieces are part of one solid mass. And Tier 3 will be the tissue broke into multiple pieces when being unwrapped. And the tissue has to be launched with something other than human power. Use rubber band, bend back a plastic spoon, blowgun with a balloon, whatever you can think of. And each team has to do 2 separate launch mechanisms, and they'll be averaged. And this was because with everything being virtual, the thought was if each team only does one, only one person gets to do it. So this way the team can try multiple different ones, pick the best 2 out of however many they build. And the score is going to be the average distance for the 2. So I'll have more details when I actually finish writing it up, but that's the basic gist of it. And so the video, and so each team has to submit videos of both machines, and the videos have to show the tissue being put into the launcher, be launched, land, and has to show the measurement from wherever it was launched from to where it ended up, and then show the unfolding to prove that it worked. Okay.
So
Big,
just out of curiosity, does water count as another object that should not fly with the tissue?
That's a really good question. If the description doesn't prohibit it, it must be allowed. I will certainly say that if the tissue is wet, unfolding it without damage is going to be really hard. Because wet tissues are extremely fragile. So I would say we should allow that, because that will make it much more fun for teams to try to figure out whether that's actually an advantage or not. And Ms. Fay, you also had a question about that?
Yeah, I just wanted to double check that will be out by next Tuesday so that we can.
Yeah, that will be out right after this talk.
That's fine. I just wanted to make. That's fine. Perfect.
Because the other 2 events are already ready. And the date for the next meet is the 16th.
Yep.
A non-contact slingshot. Yeah, I mean, basically you can pinch the slingshot or the rubber band, pull it back and let go. So it's not that you're not allowed to touch it. It's just that the energy that launches the tissue needs to be, sorry, my cat is being a pest. The energy that launches the tissue has to come from something other than you throwing it. So you can't, we had one event where years ago where somebody figured out that to launch their paper airplane, they could just take a plastic bag, pinch it, and as long as the plastic was touching it, not their fingers, it counted according to the rules. And so that would not be allowed. So the energy has to come from something other than human. Okay. So that's about all the league business I'm aware of. I'm going to actually hand it over to Ms. Fay, league president, and then after that I'll introduce Heather and we can get started with the presentation.
I will be really quick, folks, since Mr. Bigelow did a nice job explaining the build event, which will be exciting. So I want to welcome you all for our 3rd STEM talk of the year, and glad to see you're still out there. And after a vacation that I hope was restful for some of you, today it's exciting to have a former NSL participant rejoin us, and Mr. Bigelow will do the formal presentation of our guest today. But thank you all for continuing to show interest. And Mr. Bigelow, thank you for helping to set today up.
Hey, thank you, Ms. Fay. Okay, so Heather Cummings, our presenter, was a student of mine at Lynn English class of 2016 and WPI class of 2020. studied aerospace engineering, and now works for Sikorsky Helicopter. And Heather was one of my champions of all of the build events. Spent many hours in my classroom working with power tools and all manner of such, and lots of good times. And so it's really exciting for me to have her come back and present to us and show us what she's been doing ever since. So without further ado, Heather Cummings.
All right, thank you. I'm going to start sharing my screen now then. We'll hop right into this. Oh, actually, give me 1 second. I need to share with audio here. Okay, let me know if you can see that. All right, so as Mr. Bigler said, my name is Heather Cummings, and I have some fun presentation stuff today about my job that I work in flight controls and autonomy engineering. So a little bit about me, as kind of was already stated, I attended WPI for aerospace engineering from 2015 to 2020. I got both my bachelor's and master's degree there, and after finishing my bachelor's, I went on to work for the Sikorsky Aircraft Corporation. Sikorsky is the home of helicopters. The inventor of the helicopter was a guy named Igor Sikorsky. And nowadays, Sikorsky is mostly known for being the creators of the Black Hawk helicopter. I had no idea when I started college that I wanted to do flight controls engineering. I did a lot of more mechanical type builds when I was in high school, building all manner of systems, and I thought that I would want to go into airframe design and the mechanical design behind aircraft. But I worked on a series of projects in college that really gave me insight into not wanting to do that and wanting to go into more of the software and electrical side of flight controls instead. So for a little bit about those first, some projects that I worked on at school first include a project called ACAP. This is the Autonomous Cargo Aircraft Project, and it was a senior capstone for the robotics department at WPI when I was a sophomore. I was mainly in a support role for this project here, working on testing and helping in the hands-on design and implementation into the aircraft, where the robotics engineers were mainly the head of what was going on. I still helped out when they had everything in and were testing. The goal of this was to take this single engine small aircraft that you see here and be able to take the pilot out of the seat and have it fly itself for the purpose of cargo transport. By the end of the project, we were able to fly this plane in a simulation and do ground tests of it. And working on this, I got a real hands-on approach for how the flight controls in the aircraft are designed and started to pursue this a bit further. So when I got to my senior year, I worked on the flight controls of a small RC airplane for my capstone project. This plane was designed for a competition called the SAE Aero Design Competition. And the goal was to carry as much PVC pipe as possible on the smallest aircraft that we could design. And the aircraft also had to fit within a 1 foot by 1 foot by 4 inch box when it was totally disassembled. Most of what I did on this project involved the flight control design of the orange pieces that we see here, the parts that will actually move the plane as it's flying, as well as some software design for an autopilot system that we used because this aircraft was kind of heavy. It wasn't the most maneuverable thing. So for our RC pilot to be able to fly our competition course successfully, we wanted to give him some help. So we designed a small autopilot system that got implemented towards the end of the project. So after all of that, in college, I knew that flight controls is really what interested me and really what I wanted to be going into, which is how I started at Sikorsky. So at Sikorsky, I work on flight controls, specifically electrical flight controls, which would be fly-by-wire systems, as well as autonomous systems. So the helicopter that's shown here is called Sarah. This is the Sikorsky Autonomy Research Aircraft. We use this as essentially an experimental test vehicle for our autonomy algorithms that we're developing. For this specific helicopter, I was working on an obstacle avoidance system that we were hoping to use in future production aircraft for aiding pilot in poor visual environments, and for maybe one day having helicopters that don't need a pilot at all. In terms of autonomy, this is really where we have the focus, but what I enjoy more is the fly-by-wire controls. I find these are more experimental in nature for creating more interesting new aircraft, and it's the future of control systems. So a fly-by-wire control system takes all the mechanical linkages that are normally found in aircraft and replaces it with this flight control computer and a series of wires. Excuse me for 1 second. So in most old aircraft, we would have direct cables and pulleys between the control stick that the pilot uses and the surface that they're actually controlling. These are really heavy, and there's no assistance to the pilots for the maneuverability and capabilities of the aircraft, so they can be kind of rough to control sometimes. Fly-by-wire controls, however, since we have a flight control computer in between where the pilot is inputting their commands and the actual control surfaces, we can give some assistance to the pilot as well as reduce weight that's on the aircraft by removing all of these physical linkages. This assistance can come in the form of better autopilot systems and just smaller help, like being able to react to turbulence better and react to wind and other environmental effects. Not only is there a reduction in weight and some assistance to the pilot, it is much easier to add in our future autonomy to these flight control computers and fly-by-wire systems, since the computer already exists and we already have all the sensors that we need. If you were to try to take an autonomy system and put it into a mechanical control system, you have to add more computers, add more sensors, and it's a lot more complicated. The aircraft shown at the bottom here is called Raider. This is a fly-by-wire aircraft that I started working on when I first joined Sikorsky. This is a great example of how fly-by-wire controls can really expand the capabilities and maneuverability of a helicopter. Since we can provide so much assistance to the pilot, we can really push how far we can take this aircraft, and it can fly faster, it can hover in strange orientations and do things that you wouldn't be able to do with a normal conventional aircraft. Also, you notice that there are two rotors stacked on top of each other here. When we try to fit a mechanical system with all of the connections that go inside the rotor of a helicopter, you can start having problems with mechanical interference. So the fly-by-wire control system makes something like this much more possible, since we don't have to worry about quite as many mechanical linkages, but rather the signals through the wires that get to the rotor hub instead. So for Raider, to kind of demonstrate this, I have a short little video here that is one of our test pilots talking about flying the Raider helicopter. Load up. Here we go.
My name is Christian Corey, and I'm an experimental test pilot at Sikorsky Aircraft. In the Raider program, I'm sort of one of the guys that has the opportunity to fly the aircraft, but also participates in some of the developmental meetings and the design. How do we get to the next step? So it's a bit of what we do. You could do things where you'd want to target something, for example, and you can sort of hang there better than on a traditional helicopter. It gives you more flexibility in how to operate. Straight up, like, speed is going to be the advantage. It's a lot faster than you can go in a traditional helicopter. On X2, you're able to go faster without rotating the fuselage. So it's a level attitude that you maintain throughout, you know, your speed sweep, if you will. I think the biggest difference between a fundamental, like traditional helicopter and the X2 is that prop that's on the back, right? It's taken really like the best part of like a vertical, a STOVL, like a Harrier or the new Joint Strike Fighter that can, you know, it's this jet that can take off or land vertically and then go forward. X2 and the Raider can do that indefinitely, the same as a helicopter, until it's time to go fast, and then it operates better in that regime as well.
Forget everything you know about helicopters. X2 technology combines the best elements of low-speed helicopter performance with the cruise performance of an airplane. It's going to change the game.
They always have very dramatic music in the background of these videos. So that's kind of a look at one of the fly-by-wire programs that we have here. So those two slides talked mainly about kind of a more high-level view of what we do with autonomy and what we do with fly-by-wire systems. But what does this actually look like for those of us who work on these? So there are three major steps that happen for designing systems, either fly-by-wire or autonomy. We have our sensor design and selection, the software design, and the testing phases. Sensor design and selection is probably my least favorite part of the work that I do, but it's still extremely important. We need to provide a ton of data to the aircraft via these sensors. And what kind of data do we need? So when you have an airplane here, if you're a pilot sitting in the seat, you can see out the window and you could see around you and you have instruments in front of you. Well, we need to provide all of that information to the computer when we start looking at autonomy and fly-by-wire. Most of this can be done by answering a few questions. For example, where are we? Where is the aircraft in the world, in the sky? How fast are we moving in any direction, up, forwards? How is that motion changing, as well as our orientation? What is the environment around us like? This could be weather, it could be terrain, it could be being at an airport. And then how is the aircraft itself doing? How are our internal systems, like our engine? Is our engines performing correctly? Is there anything that we need to be worried about? And a few of these sensors then answer those questions. So for example, for where are we can look at our GPS position. So we'll have a GPS sensor on the aircraft that can tell us where in the world we are. We can also get data such as our altitude from radar and from the air data system, which would be our temperature probe and pitot-static tube. A pitot-static tube reads in the air velocity as well as pressures outside the aircraft so that we can get data such as our forward speed, our vertical speed, and what another source of what our altitude is. In terms of our environment, we have things like our LiDAR sensor, which is used with other cameras to get a picture of our environment. It helps us to see if there's any terrain or obstacles coming in front of us, and helps to identify other aircraft flying nearby and sometimes even weather systems. And for how our aircraft motion is changing, we'll have things like an inertial measurement unit, which is a series of gyroscopes, as well as some accelerometers that can tell us, is the nose pointing down? Is it pointing up? Are we turning? And how that's changing over time. And then finally, our internal systems, we can get some engine data. So it's kind of hard to picture how the engine data would look, but basically it's usually a system of temperature and pressure gauges, as well as our fuel gauge for how much fuel we have left, to tell us the state of the engine and make sure it's performing as it should. All of this is really important information to be provided to an autonomy system, but it's also important for a fly-by-wire system to provide to the pilot. And we do this in a series of displays so that they can make judgments on their environment as well. So this is a little bit of a lot to look at, but for a pilot, these would each be individual pages, so you wouldn't be seeing all of this information at once. But essentially, we could have a page for our engine where we have the temperature and pressure gauges that I was talking about, as well as our fuel level, which can tell us how much farther we can fly. Then we'll have our primary flight display. This is the majority of what a pilot would actually be looking at in an aircraft, with our altitude, airspeed, orientation in 2 axes with respect to the ground, and then our magnetic heading, which direction are we going, north, south, east. And then another one that's more specific to some autopilot and flight control systems would be a flight control page that can tell you the status of all of your sensors. So for example, the LiDAR here is in red, so that tells us that there's something wrong with our LiDAR and we should probably try to address that, as well as how our control surfaces are changing. So if a pilot is in an autonomous plane and they're just seeing the aircraft react, they can monitor this to make sure it's reacting how it should. Once we have all of our sensor information, we move on to software design. This is the bulk of what I do, and it's some of the more interesting work. And this is why I went into flight controls at college to begin with. So we have what we would call a control diagram. This can be simplified a bit so that we have 3 major parts. First is, where do we want to be? That's our input. So this could be something like, what altitude do we want the aircraft to be at? Which direction we want to be heading in? Or it can be more complicated, like an entire flight path. And then we have, where are we now? Which is all of our sensor data. Once we know where we are and where we want to be, we can figure out how we want to get there. So this is the bulk of what controls is how do we get where we want to be. Autopilots already exist that do this. So the difference between just a general autopilot system that has a diagram like this to control the aircraft is really in where we want to be, where we want to be going. There's a lot of autonomy work that goes into the path to get you somewhere. So where an autopilot system, the pilot would be able to input, I want to be at 500 feet altitude heading north, and the aircraft would be following that. The path planning part of autonomy, the pilot can say, I want you to fly me from Boston to Orlando, and the aircraft figures out how it does that. And that's where we get path planners that create these sort of trajectories through space. So here we go. We have our point A where we're starting and our point B where we want to get to. And the goal in autonomy is to generate a safe path that we can follow based on the constraints of our aircraft through space. We can create paths in general space like this however we want, but what really becomes important when we're looking at autonomy and adding it to aircraft and integrating it into the systems we have now is obstacle avoidance. Each of these cells represents some obstacle in space, whether it be physical terrain or weather, and we want to generate the path that goes through it safely. This is the bulk of where we are at with autonomy, is generating paths with the sensors that are available now. The sensors for aircraft can really limit what they can do in autonomy, because say you have a camera that can only see 100 feet in front of you. Well, you can't fly very fast if you can only see 100 feet in front of you, because you won't have time to react to obstacles as they show up. And so if you have a camera that can see 1,000 feet in front of you, though, you can fly a lot faster. This isn't just beneficial for helicopters and airplanes that fly themselves. It's also really good for helping out pilots in the seat when they enter an environment that's not very good visually. This would be things like entering clouds, entering fog, operating at night, maneuvering around airport environments. You could sense other aircraft around you. One of the major projects I'm working on now is specifically, how do we take our sensors to figure out the constraints of an aircraft? So it's essentially creating a simulator where we can say, I want 5 of this sensor facing this direction and another 2 facing this direction. And do I have a clear enough picture to get through terrain using that information? After we've got some sort of software design that we think is going to work, we move on to testing. Testing is big because it's never going to work the first time. You're always going to find problems in what you first designed. And there are countless hours that go into doing this in multiple stages. The first major stage is done just on computers. It's just on our desktops, where we'll have some sort of aircraft model that we provide trajectories for and tell it, go fly to this location. And then we get a bunch of graph outputs of how it does in doing that. Typically at this stage, we're looking at bigger issues such as, is the aircraft trying to turn really hard, or is it trying to dive to the ground when it's trying to do some of its maneuvers? So this looks at kind of a bigger trend, but also gives us a baseline of data to look at when we move on to simulation testing. This is my favorite part of doing flight controls work. We can create a fake cockpit that's not the actual aircraft and run a flight simulator with it to get a real feel of how this aircraft will handle, and run flight tests that way. The engineers get to be involved in the flight process here too, because we're going to be on the ground for all of this. It's done through a simulator. So all of us engineers get to sit in the seat and fly the airplane at least once. And it's really a lot of fun to do that. These simulators at this point are also very accurate. So we can do most of our testing here to make sure the aircraft is going to be safe before we put a pilot in the seat and tell them to go fly it. Because we want to make sure that nothing is going to go wrong when we, especially in experimental systems where we're trying to prove that something is going to be safe and that it's going to work correctly. Let's see. When I worked on Raider, the bulk of the work that I did was sitting in the simulator and flying flight tests. So I think that's probably also part of why that's my favorite program at Sikorsky. Another really interesting thing about these sims is we can connect it to real hardware and essentially trick the aircraft into thinking it's flying, even though it's still on the ground. This gives really good data for how the control surfaces are going to move. Are they moving too fast? Are they trying to do something way too aggressively? Or is it transitioning smoothly through each of the maneuvers we want it to do? Once we have done countless hours testing in the simulator, we finally get to do our flight tests. This is where everything that we've done all comes together, or it doesn't. Most of the time it does. At this point, we've fixed our software problems. We're sure that this aircraft is going to be safe for the pilot to fly. So we get to fly the real life thing, see it take off the tarmac for the first time. This part's still very dangerous, and we still have to be very vigilant in checking out all of our systems when we get here, even though we've done so much testing. But that's why we do so much testing in the first place. Seeing the aircraft take off for the first time and knowing that you were part of the team that made this possible is a pretty awesome feeling, no matter how big or small the team that you work on is, because some of these projects can get really big. I worked on one team that was 12 people, and the next project I worked on was 700 people across 2 companies. So there's really quite a lot of variety in what you're seeing, but there's always that same feeling of I was part of this and I got to help make this fly. And one thing that's kind of fun about autonomy is we get a few more sort of first flights than most, because a lot of our new algorithms have to be treated as if they are a first flight all over again, and we have to do a lot of new testing. So the feeling of seeing a brand new thing fly comes a lot more often. I have one more short little video here about this exact helicopter, Sarah, flying with some autonomy software. Something that's kind of fun about this before I get to the video is that Sarah has been in operation for quite a long time at this point. So most of the operations are done entirely autonomously. So even though there's a pilot sitting in the seat, they aren't touching anything. They're just sitting there because they have to for the purpose of flight test. And so they can control the entire aircraft just by holding an iPad and telling it, fly me to this next airport. So it's a part of what we will see here. So there are a few things that aren't very well shown in that or described, but first I'll note that Alias is just the autonomy system that is controlling the aircraft. It's just saying that the autonomy system is self-contained in the aircraft and they're not receiving commands from any outside sources. The aircraft is deciding where it's going to go in real time as it flies. And they also have a mention that 30 miles from the ground station, the operator can control the aircraft with a tablet. Someone else at an approved ground station can control this aircraft without being in the aircraft is really what they were trying to show. So if you have a fully autonomous aircraft with no one in it, we could have the aircraft return to home base by just sending it a command saying, come home, no matter where it is. So that's about everything I had talking about flight controls and autonomy. So I guess at this point, we'll open up to questions about any of that.
Okay, so feel free to throw questions into the chat, or you can just unmute and ask them, or whichever.
So I actually had a question. I noticed in the in the helicopter, in the Raider, I think it was, that you had the double stack propellers.
Yep.
Now that looks an awful lot like the helicopter that we just sent to Mars. So I guess I was just wondering, is there any like connection there? Did you guys have any conversations with them? I mean, I've never seen that particular setup before, so I was just kind of curious.
Yeah, sure. So those were actually totally independently designed. Though there may have been some influence from Raider, because Raider came. It's at this point becoming old in terms of future technologies. But the real benefit is by doing those dual coax rotors, you don't need a tail rotor. The purpose of the tail rotor that you see on aircraft is to prevent the whole thing from spinning, because the whole prop on top is spinning. So those two props move in opposite directions to counteract that, which is probably why they did it on Mars, so that they could have a closer contained object by having it all stay in kind of one unit without the tail piece sticking out for the tail rotor.
That's cool. Actually, I think one of the reasons they did it on the Mars one was just to sort of funnel the air down, because the atmospheric density is so low. But I'm sure that the fact that it prevents the rotation was a factor as well.
I was just kind of speculating about what I thought it might be, so it's interesting to know what it actually is. Yeah, the real benefit too to that dual coax rotor system, for Raider especially, is we can put that prop on the back to propel the aircraft forward rather than needing to counteract torque. So it really is what allows it to get some of those seriously high speeds for a helicopter.
Nice. Mr. Bigelow, I don't know if you noticed, but a question popped up in the chat.
Yeah, I see it. Heather, can you see the chat?
Let's see. Yes, I think so.
Okay, otherwise I can read the question out loud.
Yep, okay. How long did it take to complete bachelor's and master's? And what advice would you give to an aspiring aero engineer? So I did the bachelor's in the standard 4-year format. And then WPI has a BS-MS program where when you're a senior, you can start taking graduate classes and then do 1 extra year to get your master's degree. Definitely advice I have for an aspiring aero engineer: try the different fields. You might not know how much you'll enjoy something until you start working in it. I know that was definitely the case for me. I loved mechanics before I got to college, and then after trying some projects in controls, I realized how much more I like that. And definitely don't be scared to step out of what you think you're gonna like into something else, because you might learn something about yourself in the process. Of course.
One of the interesting things when you were talking about obstacle avoidance that I was wondering about is, does the software have the ability to track moving obstacles and make predictions? I'm thinking maybe some of the things that are currently done by air traffic controllers, where if the software is aware of moving objects like other aircraft, if it can plot paths to avoid them, and ultimately maybe even have systems like this that can talk to each other and plot paths cooperatively somehow. So if you can talk to that a little bit, that'd be great.
Sure. So a lot of what's being tested right now is more for static objects, for terrain, especially because helicopters, which this is mainly being used on, tend to fly at much lower altitudes than airplanes. Airplanes, especially commercial ones, are often at something like 30,000 feet, whereas a helicopter could be 50 to 100 feet off the ground. So you want to know where telephone poles and telephone wires are. But that's definitely something being looked into for how we can track, especially in congested airport environments, when you're trying to enter an aircraft traffic pattern around an airport, you want to know where the other aircraft are. There is some work on communication between similar aircraft having these systems to be able to create paths together, to fly in sort of formation flights together. So that's definitely part of what's being worked in these tests as well, is how can we then communicate between other aircraft and use some of these obstacle avoidance systems together. But the application of tracking moving targets hasn't quite made it there yet for us. Any other questions out there?
So I was just wondering, when watching that video with the engineer sitting in the seat and just monitoring on the iPad, and you said someone can control it from 30 miles away. Is that the limit, or can it go farther? And if not yet, would satellites for internet connection make it farther?
Yeah, so right now it's really up to the sensors that or data links that we get on the aircraft. Some of the technology, it's just easier to have closer communication. So there is a limited range to it, especially because some of the data links need to be done in line of sight. So you have to have a direct line to the aircraft. There are beyond line of sight connections, which Sarah has for the 30-mile distance between the two airports that it flew to. But I think the limit right now for that is somewhere on the scope of about 50 miles. It definitely would be interesting to look into the use of satellites for that kind of communication. I think a worry there would be when you start looking at military helicopters, what the encryption of that data would look like and make sure it can't be interfered with.
I would imagine the time lag in the transmission might be an issue as well.
Yeah, for sure. I could see that being an issue.
I know that Lockheed Martin tends to have military contracts, but the first thing that actually came to my mind was in terms of being able to send supplies or rescue missions without a pilot, in terms of even just within the continental US for humanitarian issues. Is that something that you think that, I mean, maybe not this particular frame, but would you design a different frame with the same capabilities that would be more designed towards evac or supply?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, a big part of what Sikorsky is interested in, obviously lots of government contracts, is in firefighting and search and rescue. So there are other applications for this kind of software and these kind of capabilities to be used in getting to difficult areas that might not be so great for people to enter. And I could definitely see an application being used for delivering supplies, even for this going on to, say, a government helicopter. It could probably still be used for the delivery of supplies, especially if it were for the National Guard or something like that. If they had the capability to not need to be in the aircraft for entering worsening environments, it would be helpful. They could just send supplies in one of these aircrafts to a location. There's a question on the chat. What are some courses and skills that are necessary to work in flight controls? So in studying aerospace engineering, there's generally going to be some sort of track that you can go towards where you'll take controls courses in an intro to control design, in aircraft controls, spacecraft controls. Sometimes you have to seek it out a little bit. For example, at WPI, there are 3 major tracks that you can follow for aerospace, and you have to take courses in each of the three, but you can choose to expand on one of them. So the offerings were exactly spacecraft controls, aircraft controls. There was an interesting one about doing quadcopter control design. So if there is offering for robotics as well, that's really a huge part of this and where it's going. Robotics courses are very, very helpful for the flight controls if you're not specifically in aerospace engineering, but you're in electrical or something like that. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's probably about what it would be. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, are there any other questions? Okay, that sounds like about it. So Heather, thank you so much. This was a wonderful talk. I know I learned a lot. I'm sure everyone else did too. So